All right, everyone, let's go over how to read a crochet pattern. In this video, I'm going to use my bumblebee pattern from Our Friendly World as an example. If you've never crocheted before, you might not understand all of the terms about specific stitches and techniques, but that's okay. For this video, I just want you to understand the structure of how a pattern is written. You don't have to know right away what all of the different terms mean, but I just want you to have a feel for how to read through a pattern once you understand what those terms do mean. I do know that oftentimes for beginners, reading a pattern can feel daunting or overwhelming, and there are a lot of tutorials for how to make a project out there that are in video form to walk you through each step. But as a crocheter, it is really great to be able to read a pattern because that just opens up so many options for the projects that you can make. If you go on Pinterest or Etsy or Ravelry or just Google crochet patterns, there are so many out there that are only available in the form of a written pattern, and so it's a really great skill to have to be able to look at any written pattern and make that project if you're interested in it. So with that, let's go through all of the parts and pieces of this written crochet pattern. And keep in mind that every pattern is structured and written a little differently. Every designer has their own style and format for how they put together their patterns. This is, of course, an example of one that I've written and sell through Our Friendly World, and it'll have a lot of similar parts to other patterns, but not every pattern that you ever purchase or use from different designers will all look the same. So this is just a cover page. When you open up your PDF, it reminds you what this pattern is and has a picture of what we're making. On page 2 in every Our Friendly World pattern, I make a note about the eco-friendly materials that we try to use at Our Friendly World. I think it's really important to remind crafters that we do have a choice in what materials we use, so I just wanted to give you some tips here for plastic-free materials if you're interested. And then in any pattern, there should be a list of the materials you'll need. Sometimes they'll be very specific about the yarn colors or the yarn brands, or they'll just point you in a general direction of the colors and the weight of yarn that you'll need for your pattern. And now we've arrived to the abbreviations or the terms section. Throughout the written part of the pattern, instead of writing out the full name for every single stitch and technique, there are common abbreviations. So in the beginning of the pattern, I like to let you know what those abbreviations stand for in case you're working through it and you're not completely sure. There are US crochet terms and UK crochet terms, so those differ a little bit. All of Our Friendly World's patterns are written in United States terms, but if you come across a pattern written in United Kingdom terms, just be sure to do some research on the differences between those. And again, right now, if you've never crocheted or you haven't used a pattern with these terms in it, as you're looking at these abbreviations, you might be unsure what they even mean, but that's okay. Right now, I just want you to understand that this is a section letting you know the different techniques that are used in whatever pattern you're starting with. And now we've arrived to the gauge section. This is a little bit complicated for beginners, but I'm going to break it down to the best of my ability. So when every person crochets, they naturally use a different tension. You hold your yarn a little differently, your hook a little differently. Each person might make their stitch more loose or more tight. So even if two people are creating the exact same crochet pattern, it could turn out to be a completely different size. For things like sweaters and other garments that you'll be wearing and you want them to fit a certain way, or if you want a blanket of a certain size, paying attention to the gauge is really important because you don't want to make an entire piece and then realize when you're finished that it's not the size you had hoped. When you're making things like this bumblebee pattern or other stuffed animals, if you aren't dead set on a specific size that you want the final product to come out to be, you don't have to worry too much about the gauge. You can just make your pattern, and if you're fine with it turning out a little bit small or a little bit bigger than you had assumed, then you don't have to get hung up on this section. But for this specific pattern, to test out if you are going to make it the same size as the original design, in a 4 by 4 inch square of single crochet stitches, you should have 15 stitches and 16 rows. So that just explains to you how to read what that gauge means. And I know right now that that might not be important for the pattern you're making, or you might not fully understand what that even means, but that's okay. If you're ever making a pattern that is very specific about the size of what your final piece should be, make sure to dig into gauge, watch another video breaking it down further. But I just wanted you to know that that's what the gauge section is. And here I let you know that if you match this gauge, your final bumblebee will be about 4 inches long and 3 inches wide. But again, if you aren't dead set on it being that exact size, you don't have to worry about the gauge section very much at all. And now we've arrived to the notes section. The notes are just built in there if there's anything the designer wanted to make you aware of before going into the pattern. So for this one specifically, I talk about working in continuous rounds and how to change colors between stitches. And again, you don't need to know all of the details of how to do that, but just be aware that if your designer leaves you a notes section in their pattern, you should read it because it would probably have some pretty important information in it. And now on the next page, we have reached the first set of actual instructions. And oftentimes when you are reading a crochet pattern, this is how it will be laid out. Breaking it down by each round in this case because we're working in a circle, or if you're making a flat piece, this could be worked in rows as well. It may say row 1 instead of round 1. And now I'm just going to walk you through how to understand each line of this. And again, if you haven't crocheted or used these specific techniques, you might not understand what each word is actually telling you to do, but I want you to see how it's broken down. And once you move ahead and you learn how to do a single crochet or an increase, you can always come back to this video for it to make a little bit more sense as you're working your way through your pattern. But I just wanted you to know where to start with the structure of a pattern. So in round 1, I'm letting you know what color yarn to start with, and that you're going to make 6 single crochet stitches in a magic circle. And remember that in the beginning of the pattern, in the abbreviation section, we broke down that SC stands for single crochet. So now as you're reading this, you know that this stands for 6 single crochet in a magic circle. Now at the end of the line here, we have it broken down for how many total stitches you've made in that round. Since we've only made 6 single crochet into our magic circle, we have a total of 6 stitches. And once you've done that, you've completed round 1. Moving down to round 2, it now says increase. We learned in the abbreviation section that INC stands for increase times 6. So you're going to increase 6 times. An increase is where you work 2 stitches into 1 stitch. So in each of these 6 stitches from the previous round, I'm now working 2 stitches. And so by the end of the round, once I've worked 2 stitches in every stitch, I'll have a total of 12 stitches for that row because I did 2 stitches 6 times, which equaled 12 stitches by the end of the row. Again, this might make more sense to you once you actually understand how these stitches all come together when you move further through the learning process. But once you learn those stitches, if you come back to this, it'll make sense really easily. Now moving on to round 3, we've introduced another new piece, which is these parentheses. Anytime you see parentheses in a crochet pattern, that means this is a set of information that is probably going to be repeated. So this time I'm working 1 single crochet, and then in the next stitch I'm working an increase, and I'm going to do that 6 times. Instead of just 1 stitch 6 times, I'm doing this set of stitches 6 times. So once I do a single crochet and then an increase 2 stitches in the next stitch. So that's a total of 3 stitches. Once I do that 6 times, I'll have a total of 18 stitches worked in that round. And as you're working in a circle, you will also be using a stitch marker to mark the first stitch of each circle so that you don't get lost on where your first stitch is. So this end section of each row telling you how many total stitches you should have is really helpful, because when you've finished a row, you can go back and count your stitches, make sure that you have 18, and then you'll know you're on the right track. So you can see as we move down, rows 4, 5, and 6 have that exact same structure. You're just following the instructions in the parentheses 6 times around, and then you'll have the total number of stitches at the end of each round. Jumping down here, for the first time, we have multiple rounds written in one line. And that's because for each round, you're doing the exact same step. So in round 6, we worked 4 single crochet and an increase 6 times for a total of 36 stitches. In round 7, we're just going to single crochet in each of those stitches. We aren't increasing or decreasing our number, so we're still at 36. And you're going to do that for rows 7, 8, and 9. And sometimes if you're making something really big, like say you're making a blanket, and it's the same stitch for every row, you could have 100 rows. And this might say row 3 through 100 single crochet. And you'll know to repeat that same thing for every single row that it's notated for. And now for this specific bumblebee pattern, we're making a note here that after row 9, you aren't going to be working in yellow anymore. You're going to add your black stripe. And it just says change to black. And if you remember back in the notes section from the previous page, I made a note here about how to change colors. So if you ever have a question about a certain technique that a designer used, they may have left you instructions in the notes section for how to do that specific piece of the process. All right, so we're back here where we finished round 9. Change to black, but do not cut the yellow yarn because we'll be using it again. And now you can just follow this down the rest of the way. You understand what each of these rows are telling you to do. Now for this bumblebee pattern, it isn't a flat piece, it is a round stuffed animal. So it also lets you know here where to start stuffing your piece. And then you're going to just decrease rounds. So again, you might not know what these techniques mean if you've never done them before, but now you understand the structure of this line. So in this line, we learned that in the abbreviations section, SKST stands for skip a stitch. So in this line, I'm just telling you to skip a stitch, work 3 single crochet, repeat that process 6 times for a total of 18 stitches. And then down here, it lets you know exactly how to finish off the piece by slip stitching, fastening off, which just means tying a knot, and then sew the hole shut with the yarn tail. Even if you don't know what those mean, you now understand the structure of how the pattern was written to tell you how to make this body part for the bumblebee. Some sections of a crochet pattern might not be so straightforward, or they might not take as long. For example, the antenna in this bumblebee pattern don't have a ton of rows or a ton of stitches to them, so it's mostly written out just in this very short sentence form. And if you know what the abbreviations mean as you read that, it will start to make sense to you. And again, for the wings, here is an example of something that is worked as a flat piece. So instead of saying round 1, since we aren't working in circles, this now says row 1. It lets you know what color to start with. You'll chain 3 and then turn. And again, you may not know what that means now, but once you watch a video learning how to chain and work single crochets, that will make sense to you. Oftentimes in a flat pattern, when you're working back and forth across rows, you'll see this letting you know to chain and turn your piece over to start the next row. As you can see, this pattern does have pictures throughout it. I try to include pictures in my patterns where I can. I know the visual can be helpful. Some designers won't use any pictures. Some patterns are very old and won't have pictures. Some may just have all of the pictures at the end of the pattern instead of spread throughout. So just a reminder that every pattern is laid out a little bit differently. And now there's just one more section to go over, and that is this section called Making Up. And that could be called something a little different in each pattern. But basically, for this stuffed animal pattern, it is all of the last bits of steps that you need to do to put everything together. So all of the previous pages were helping you make each individual piece, the body, the wings, the antenna, and now this section is walking you through exactly how to put all of those together to get your final product of this cute little bumblebee. And then for any Our Friendly World patterns, you will find a page of information about how to get in contact with us if you have any questions. Also make note that designers should let you know if you're allowed to sell items made from their pattern or not. For me specifically, I do let people sell things that they make using my pattern, but I would like the company to be credited as the designer. However, it is illegal for you to sell or copy any part of the pattern itself. So while people are allowed to sell the bumblebee they made, they are not allowed to sell or share or redistribute the actual content, this PDF pattern that they purchased. And that's just to protect designers. They put a lot of hard work into their patterns, and you're supporting them by purchasing their patterns, so you just don't want to spread their information around to people who have not paid for it. I hope that this video serves as a good reference for you on understanding how to read a pattern. If you ever need to brush up on what certain sections of a pattern mean, you can always refer back to this video. And once you learn individual terms that are used throughout crochet patterns, they'll all start to make a lot more sense to you as time goes on and you get more and more comfortable with your new hobby.